He is a geneticist, director of the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, and host of the podcast Brave New Planet. Please welcome Eric Lander. Eric, so good to have you here. Thank you so much.
Hey, great to be here, John.
I just want to say I love the podcast, and I hope everybody checks it out. It is a fascinating look into a bunch of really big scientific questions, from misinformation to climate change, but does it in a way that's unexpected and fascinating. So I really encourage everybody to check it out. So Eric, I wanted to start by asking you about the pandemic because, you know, as you said, the podcast talks about dystopia and utopia, and it does seem as though we've seen both in equal measure in the past basically week or so. We have this terrible third wave, which is an entirely preventable disaster. But on the other hand, we've seen Pfizer announce a vaccine that's 90% effective. Then Moderna announces they got a vaccine that's 94.5% effective. And then Pfizer says, the competitive older brother, actually ours is 95% effective. Can you talk a little bit about this achievement?
I would describe the scientific achievements as kind of this light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a really long tunnel. It's really a dangerous tunnel. And we're kind of asking, how did we get in this tunnel in the first place? And why are we here? And so it's like holding all of those things simultaneously in our heads, because, you know, we didn't have to be here. You and I are talking on November 19th. So yesterday, the US passed 250,000 deaths. We had almost 2,000 deaths just in the day. And the number of people who are new cases every day is creeping up to about 200,000. And this is much worse than we've seen before. And the vaccines are amazing achievements, but it's going to be many, many months before they're all really rolled out in full. So we have to hold these two things in our head simultaneously, that we're in the midst of a terrible storm that's going to cause a lot more death and suffering. And yet, in record time, much less than a year, many different companies produced and are running clinical trials on vaccines. And you think about it, the land speed record for making a vaccine, it's been 4 years. Often it takes a lot longer than that. And if you stop for a minute and you think about what happens scientifically that makes that possible, it's pretty cool. The two vaccines, the one from Pfizer-BioNTech and the one from Moderna, both use the same approach. Instead of the old-fashioned way of make a disabled virus, kill the virus and use that to immunize people, or make a protein from the virus, they actually use a cool new trick. They take a genetic instruction from the virus's genome, wrap it up in a little lipid particle, and inject it into you, and your cells take it up and they read the instructions, what are called RNA instructions, and they make the protein to immunize you with. Now, why is this a big deal? Because it's so fast. The Chinese identified a virus, sequenced it in 2 days, put it on the internet. 2 days later, companies here were able to design the vaccine they would like to make. 2 weeks later, they could make small quantities of it. A couple months later, they could start immunizing people. And frankly, the slow step is waiting for enough people to get the disease in the placebo group and the vaccine group to see if you had a big effect. So it's hard to imagine that the design step can get any faster. I think the design could get under a week. The other parts still have to be sped up, but it's getting done. And then, I talk about the old things as old-fashioned. Those are happening too. There are a bunch of companies that have made the inactivated viruses, a bunch of companies that make viruses that carry in DNA instructions, a bunch of companies that made proteins. Everything on the menu, somebody is doing, and often multiple somebodies, and it's getting done and read out in 10 months. If you think about it, why aren't we doing this for many more things? And I think that's what people are thinking right now. Is we're watching a scientific community, which I've got to say, there's a lot of dysfunction that we've seen with regard to the pandemic, but scientifically, people have come together and figured out how to do things fast without compromising safety. And I'm impressed, and I just want to make sure we don't lose that, because this sure isn't going to be the last time we need it. This is not the last pandemic. Rate of new outbreaks of new viruses and things like that, it's sort of doubling every 5 years. And God forbid there was a bioweapon. So this is not a one-off. I mean, the last big pandemic like this was a century ago. The next one is not going to be that far off.
And so how much do you see this as changing how we do things going forward? Like, how much will this influence other processes for making vaccines, making treatments, outside of even just viruses? Like, what are the lessons that are going to be applied to all kinds of ways we treat disease?
Well, look, there are geeky science lessons like, oh, using RNA is an interesting sort of thing to do something. And then there are kind of operational lessons of how you can get trials set up quickly, approvals done quickly and safely. So I think kind of, political lessons about how agencies can work together. We've seen, although sadly not, the United States right now, but we've seen a lot of international cooperation in Europe to figure out how to do these things. I want to see the after action from this, because, just like other crises, people have written reports that are the after action of 9/11 or Katrina. There are a lot of negative lessons to learn from this, and there are a lot of positive lessons, and we got to figure out how to institutionalize them. I think in my optimistic self, and like I say, I'm holding both of these selves in my head simultaneously, but in my optimistic self, I think we could think about all sorts of drug development, all sorts of preparation for infectious diseases, information sharing. I mean, I walk around with a long list of why couldn't we be doing this for X, Y, and Z? And, it does kind of require having a U.S. government that is forward-leaning and excited about investing in science and standing up centers to try to do things and public-private partnerships. But I think it's possible. So, I mean, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna. I just think that this seems like a pretty good success. And I bet if we tried, we could do a lot better if we were prepared, because we went in unprepared. So why couldn't we stand up millions of tests really quickly next time when there's a next time?
So, you brought up this change in leadership that we're in the middle of seeing take place, even though the outgoing party is not
not everybody's with the program yet. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But, and I will only mention Trump this once, and I apologize for doing it even once. But, after these announcements about the vaccine came out, Trump started a conspiracy about how this was meant to hurt his reelection by not announcing it. And my honest reaction was, I'm glad that that's the conspiracy he chose, because it's pro-vaccine. Right? It's the vaccine's too good. They tried to hurt me by not releasing this too good of a vaccine. I mean, what are you hoping to see in terms of public education, right? These vaccines are now being manufactured. Hopefully they continue to be proven safe and effective, and they begin being distributed. Obviously, people are going to want it, but success is about mass adoption. What are you hoping to see in the next few months to make sure we have as big a pool of people willing to take it as possible?
Well, look, I think the most important thing is transparency, because we've had so much distrust, so much conspiracy theory. I'm sorry the president thought that the vaccine approval announcements were timed to in some political way, but it's pretty clear the companies weren't given the data until a couple days before they announced. That's the way these trials work. They're kept secret by the Data Safety Monitoring Board, not revealed to the company, so nobody could have released it. But at this point now, John, I think if we're going to win trust, it's got to be by transparency. My fantasy is there's a Reddit AMA, and everybody in the country can write in with questions and say, tell me about this vaccine. And, some of the things they're going to say are, well, let's see, we tried it in 40,000 people. Half of them got the vaccine and half of them got a placebo, salt water. And we waited a bunch of months, and 160 people who got the placebo, they got infected and have symptoms. And 8 people who got the vaccine, that's roughly what the numbers are, got infected and got symptoms. So it's 20 times less. And so when people say, why is it 95%? Well, because 20 times less people got infected so far than the people who took the placebo. But then you got a lot of questions like, okay, but how does it do for older people? How does it do for women as opposed to men? How does it do for people of different races, ethnicities, health complications? How long is this protection going to last? Am I going to have to do it again? Are there short-term side effects? Yeah, there are, but it's sort of, aches and pains and flu-like symptoms. It appears to mostly be, might knock you out for 2 days and stay home, but that seems like a small price. Are there long-term? Well, we don't know yet because there hasn't been long-term. I think the more we can just say, this stuff is totally comprehensible to the general public, and the general public ought to ask questions. And when we don't know answers, we ought to say, we don't know the answer yet, and here's why, because there's no data. And you make up your mind. Would you like to take a vaccine that seems to have reduced the number of cases by 20-fold in the people who took it, and seems not to so far have side effects other than aches and pains for the 2 days after your vaccination? Do you want to risk it otherwise? In the long run, it is going to matter that enough people take it, because that's what actually cuts the spread in the end, is that a lot of people are immune. And so the virus, when it tries to get transmitted to another person, that person's immune, and it kind of exponentially dies out. That's how epidemics end. But I think there's a lot of self-interest in this too, because even for people who are not in the age groups where you're at much higher risk of dying, you're still in the age groups where you could be one of these long haulers who have long run symptoms. You could still spread it to your grandparents or your parents or something. But we got to somehow rebuild trust. And there's no better place right now to rebuild trust than around the vaccine. Even from a political point of view, there's a lot of credit to go around, and let everybody get credit for it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
If we can't manage to do that, we're really in trouble trying to take on other conspiracies and things like that, because this is one where we know a lot of stuff, we don't know everything, and we can just admit that.
Yeah, like Trump wants to take credit through Operation Warp Speed, and that's going to get a bunch of Trump people to do it. Just take the credit. And you're not worried at all about, 6 to 8 months from now, anybody who had the RNA vaccine is going to suddenly become zombified in some way. I mean, you know that every movie with a rapidly made vaccine has, about a year later, produced a pretty significant zombie population. And you think the odds of that are slim?
Look, I mean, the honest answer is, until you're 6 to 8 months out, you can't say things definitively. It's the thing about science is scientists should be careful not to say what's going to happen 10 years from now, because, you can't be absolutely certain. What you can say is, when people do things like that, there's no evidence of zombification that has been identified.
Okay, good to know. All right.
No zombies coming out of stuff like this. But, any vaccine could have a side effect in some small number of people. There are, vaccines against dengue fever, in which a small number of people, get some amplification of the disease. There are very few truly perfect solutions in the world. But then again, seatbelts aren't perfect either. They help you an awful lot. And occasionally, you get in a car crash and they don't help you. All sorts of safety measures that make a tremendous amount of sense could occasionally have a problem. And I think we're much better off saying that the upsides are very clear. The downsides, serious downsides, haven't been found. Certainly low probability of zombies. And people are grown-ups. They will make a decision. And I think when they think about, infecting elderly parents or grandparents, when they think about, risk of being one of the people who has really serious disease, or frankly, when they just think about the fact that most COVID gets passed by people who don't even know they're sick because they're not symptomatic. I think most people will make the right choice, and I hope enough of them make the right choice that, we don't lose a lot of lives, and that we also reach the point where the virus can't spread very easily. But it's going to be trust. The biggest thing that has distinguished countries that have succeeded from countries that haven't succeeded is social cohesion. Countries with high measures of social cohesion have done much better, from like New Zealand to China. And I think it's a great time for us to get together, some social cohesion. I don't know what far right host you'd like to get on your podcast where you can both get together and discuss
Absolutely
this,
not. Absolutely fucking not. No, thank you.
I knew not.
It's a hard pass. Hard pass.
Yeah, exactly.
But look, one thing you also talk about in the show is one of the obstacles to social cohesion, and it's misinformation. The podcast goes into deepfakes, and
yes.
But you also note in the show, right, that we weren't overrun by deepfakes in this election. Actually, some of the most damaging disinformation was run-of-the-mill, deceptively edited video. You talk about Pelosi being slowed down. The one that I think sort of strikes me as sort of where we're at is you have Joe Biden in Minnesota saying, "Hello, Minnesota." They take out the word Minnesota, they put in the word Florida, and all of a sudden he doesn't know where he is, right? This thing went really far. Donald Trump shared that video, right? That didn't require new technology. So it seems to me that when we talk about deepfakes, we're afraid of the creators, but we're really afraid of platforms, and we're actually afraid of consumers. People sharing things they either know are false, don't know they're false, or don't care that they're false, right? We've talked about this in the past. We end up in this conversation, every couple of months, Mark Zuckerberg and Jack go to Capitol Hill and they take their lashes, and nothing really changes. What are some of the solutions that you talk about? I recognize Reid Hoffman's voice in the podcast talking about the potential for fines per view, right? That if they publish something that is, that spreads sort of heinous, violent content or misinformation, that there's some kind of fine. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways out of this sort of misinformation spread?
Look, it's worth sorting out the different ways out that people think about. Because what's good is people are trying to struggle with how could we fix it. There are techno fixes, and then there's like regulatory fixes and economic fixes. And let's hang up for a second on the techno question, because what you're talking about with Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden getting splicing in Florida instead of Minnesota to Joe Biden's remark, those are what people sometimes call cheap fakes. And it turns out that cheap fakes rather than deep fakes work really well, because like listeners are not that discriminating, and platforms have no controls at all that would stop even the most obvious cheap fakes. But you could stop things like that if you wanted to. So for example, let's just make this up. The Joe Biden quote, "Hello, Minnesota." Well, that's on the web somewhere. So when somebody uploads "Hello, spliced Florida," if there was the famous 5-second delay that they have on television, or the stock market governors or circuit breakers or something, if it searched really quickly over the web and it said, before I'm posting this, I'm noting that the exact same "Hello, Minnesota" thing has been spliced here into that, you could see that because it's such a cheap fake. Now, the platforms aren't doing it, but if they had a liability, they probably could do it. And if things got, I don't know if the world would come crashing down if it took 5 minutes for your tweet to get posted, because it was checked to make sure that it hadn't actually spliced in a cheap fake. It would look at the Nancy Pelosi thing and say, wait a second, that's already there at real speed. So I think the question about the deep fakes is that at some point, I hope we're going to push platforms to do this basic, simple checking that the thing that's going up there was not some cheap fake. But I agree, we're not doing that yet. The deep fakes bother me because that becomes a cat and mouse game given the technology, where it's going to be hard to know. Like public comment. In the podcast, we talk about the FCC got comment on net neutrality. The current administration wanted to repeal this policy of internet neutrality, and they got 22 million comments, and like 98% of them were just bots, but creative bots that was like moving words around and all that. And shockingly, the bots were the ones who had a different opinion than the real people and carried the day. Shocking, isn't it? So I think the first order is we ought to fix the most obvious ones. Then we have to think about what are other measures. And so Reid Hoffman talks about like the shooting in the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. And he says, if your platform has videos of violence like that, shootings in that, and you're posting it, there'll be a fine per view. Now, I thought that was really creative. So if it's viewed by 20 people, all right, the platform might not care about a $5,000 fine per view. If it's viewed by, 5 million people, well, that's $25 billion. Maybe they care.
Basically, the platforms then say, well, you can't do that. You'll destroy the business. And then all of a sudden, like magic, they figure it out.
Right. So
all of a sudden, these things that were impossible, they can figure out if there's money on the line.
Well, exactly. And so I started to look at the techno to say, it's not impossible to do things. And it's not even impossible to do things fast enough. And then you got to create an incentive, like there's some financial penalty. There are other things I think about, and I don't know if it's a good idea or not. We have all of these unverified identities that are on the web spreading misinformation, bots and phony accounts and things like that. And we have this law that protects platforms from legal liability for posts. One thought is maybe, at least in the United States, you get protected for legal liability if the account is a verified account. But if it's an unverified account and nobody has recourse to go against the person who posted this, maybe it's a deep fake porn video of somebody, well, then the platform gets the liability. Well, suddenly, they might care a lot about figuring that stuff out. Now I know, and that anonymity serves a useful purpose in society. And how do we balance, where some degree of anonymity is needed and protecting whistleblowers, other things. So I don't know, but I think what we're trying to do with the conversation of the podcast, I think we ought to be doing on all these problems is encouraging people to just think up solutions, because some of them will stick. And we certainly can't keep going where we're going, where this much disinformation, again, we're not having a discussion about the aftermath of the election, but where this much disinformation can be circulating. And of course, in that context, I will acknowledge that it isn't all unverified fake accounts. We also have information spread quite effectively by accounts with verified names. But maybe we put that in another bucket to solve in other ways. So, I mean, real issue.
Well, no, what I appreciate about the conversation is that I do think, especially in politics, you see a lot of Democratic infighting about, why did some of these moderates go down in moderate districts? Is it because left-wing people talked about defund the police? Is it because moderates didn't do enough campaigning? There's a lot of recrimination, and we should have the debate about what's the best way for Democrats to win. But it seems to me a lot of times what happens right now is people only debate the questions they like. And they only debate the people that they think will join them in the conversation. What do you do when there's this big problem of misinformation and disinformation, and those people don't care about having a debate? If they wanted to have a real and sincere debate, they wouldn't be spreading misinformation. So I do appreciate that in the show, you actually get into some of the solutions to this big kind of dark cloud that hangs over politics and all of these debates, because that is the upstream. I mean, I'm mixing clouds and streams, but you get it. We're upstream and in the cloud.
They both have water, John.
They both have water. All right. Well, I've humiliated myself in front of one of the most cited scientists. It's a huge embarrassing moment. But moving on. One thing you talk about in the show too, I just want to touch on this briefly. Misinformation and the role it plays in climate. But you focused on geoengineering. And you talked about a few specific ways in which we could fight climate change through geoengineering. Can you just say what some of the options are? And then I wanna pick one to do.
Okay. So rather than take on climate change in its straight sense, and I hope we can come back to it, because I think the real answer lies in taking on climate change directly. But I thought an interesting way into it was a debate that's going on amongst at least some people in science about, well, if the Earth is getting warmer, and the Earth is getting warmer, and it's because we got carbon dioxide holding it in heat, why don't we just reflect some heat back out into space by putting up little sulfur dioxide particles? So you just go around in planes and you spray sulfur dioxide particles or other kind of particles, and they're like tiny little mirrors, and they could bounce back 1% of the sun's rays and cool off the Earth. And it sounds so seductive and tempting.
It's great. I'm in.
And of course you are. How could you not? Because it only costs about $2 billion a year which is a steal for the whole Earth, right?
Come on, that's for that kind of money, you can get a plane that doesn't fly from the Pentagon. Let's do it. I'm in.
Exactly.
I'm in.
Okay, but then the problem is, and so there's a wonderful, really smart physicist at Harvard who's proposing this, and he has a very good friend, a professor at Oxford, who says, you are, I think it is, howlingly, barkingly mad, is what he says. And the problems, of course, are once you put the particles up, you can't control where they go. So maybe they accumulate in some places and not in other places. There's good evidence to think that might be. And it might change temperatures in different parts of the world. It'll change rainfall in different parts of the world. Who knows? Might cause hurricanes. Who's got the insurance policy for that liability? That's interesting. And then he raises questions like, and you know, if we start relying on those sulfur particles up there, because it's sort of holding off the climate change temporarily, we kind of get addicted. And he calls it like the sword of Damocles, that it's hanging over you, because if you ever stop for 2 or 4 or 5 years, because, you know, God forbid there's a war or pandemic, let's say, and you don't keep going, then suddenly you get hit with all the accumulated climate change. So it would only make sense to use if you were really confident you were on a path to zero emissions. But maybe we're not confident about that. And then
we're not confident about that.
But then finally, is it the case that if we had a solution like that, people who are opposed to taking action on climate change would use it to kind of say, there's no need to proceed right now? And so I asked the proponent of this, are you concerned that your proposed solution here is actually going to get used by climate deniers, or at least climate change deniers, or people who don't want to see climate change action? And he says, I am absolutely certain it's going to get used that way, but I think we need it because, et cetera. And his friend thinks he's crazy. And I also introduce Marcia McNutt, the president of the National Academy, and Varshini Prakash, the director of the Sunrise Movement. And, you know, people are struggling. I mean, I don't know where to come down on these things. I think Varshini says something very wise in this discussion, which is, hey, if the problem is carbon dioxide emissions, how about we just solve the carbon dioxide emissions? Wouldn't that be the issue? And of course, you know, this other discussion is still a live discussion, but I think it's important to grapple with stuff like this. And maybe, John, you know, before we go, it'd be worth saying something about, can we actually find a better way to grapple with the real problem of reducing carbon dioxide emissions? Because, you know, as we go into a new administration, I worry a lot that we might not get any consensus to make progress. And, you know, I listened to the debates such as they were, you know, discussing climate change. And I think we have to find some new ways to describe this, because the idea that addressing climate change is going to wreck the economy or you know, going to be impossible, I think everybody really deep down knows there's like one solution. We figure out how to make renewable energy that's cheaper than fossil fuels. And that's a science and technology question. I mean, everything else is a temporizing measure. If we can actually make renewables cheaper than fossil fuels, well, then the market will do the rest, because it becomes the economic solution. And so really, in the end, the only way out is innovation. And we've done this before. So like I always point to, why do we have like a semiconductor industry and computers? That stuff used to be ridiculously expensive. And the US Department of Defense pumped tons of money into buying semiconductors when they were unbelievably expensive to create a market for it. They created incentives, and then that gave rise to the US being like the economic leader. I don't know why we're not thinking about it this way, because I would think if one is a, you know, pretty extreme free marketeer or not, you would say, we do want to be in that position, and government has done this before, and why don't we just get our incentives straight? We got them backwards now, get them straightened out. We've seen it's working. Solar energy's gotten a lot cheaper. Let's finish the job. And so I don't hear any of that. I listen for that, and neither, you know, nobody's really saying it's the way out. And I don't want to be Pollyanna here either, but I do think there are solutions, and we got to somehow find language that is going to be understandable by people on all sides. But this is just the optimist in me. I can, get me on a different day, and I'm as pessimistic as you are, John. But right now, I'm just feeling like, why not try to push it?
One option that's hinted at in the podcast, which I think is worth considering, is if we can get some of these island nations that are threatened by climate change, Kiribati, Vanuatu, we can get those islands together and have them basically say, we're putting the sulfur dioxide up there, whether you like it or not, and we're going to do it every year until you giant economies solve this problem. You let us know. We're going to take care of this because we have to survive. Maybe that's what we need. There's nothing to stop any country right now on Earth from deciding they're going to solve climate change for the rest of us.
Yeah, although as Marcia McNutt, the president of the National Academy, points out, they could do that for a couple $1 billion, and it's very affordable. Somebody could shoot those planes down. And even worse, she notes, you can put up gases that accelerate climate change. So if Russia wants to keep the Arctic melting so that I'm not saying they do, I'm not want to cast any aspersions on Russia, but if they wanted to have the Arctic open for navigation, there's some gases that would counteract this stuff. So sadly, John, it might require international cooperation.
All right. Well, you took us to a utopian place. I brought us back to a dystopian place. Then you brought us back. I think that's probably where we should leave it.
That's exactly right.
Eric Lander, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. The podcast is Brave New Planet. Everybody should check it out. Thank you so much.